Our scripture reading this morning is from Matthew chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born, King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star they had seen, and when it rose, went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time he'd ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. This is the word of the Lord. The theologian and writer N.T. Wright tells the story of being invited to preach the Christmas sermon at a large event at a big historic church in a large city in England. When he arrived there, and people were arriving in great numbers, he realized that in attendance was a well-known cynic who was famed for his outspoken criticism of Christianity. He'd apparently been coerced by his family and his friends to be nice for the Christmas season and to join them at this traditional service, even though he was an atheist and didn't believe in all of this. As N.T. Wright shook hands with people as they were leaving the service at the end of the time, the cynic told N.T. Wright that he could understand why Christmas remained so popular with people. After all, he said, it's this kind-hearted little story all about this cute, innocent baby in a manger. Who could possibly have anything against a baby? Wright remembers thinking to himself that this man had definitely never read the second chapter of Matthew that we've just read. It makes the Christmas story anything but cute and cuddly. And it certainly states very clearly that for all of his apparent winsomeness as a child in the manger, there are those who opposed him, and in some cases violently opposed him. Every time I read this part of the story aloud in a group setting, I'm tempted to borrow a page from the way our Jewish friends tell the story of Esther. There's also a violent and a disliked evil character in that story. He uses his power and his scheming to try and destroy the Jewish people. His name is Haman, and it's his sinister plot that Esther and Mordecai have to oppose to save the Jewish people. When the story is read out loud, the children are given these loud, clackety wooden noisemakers. And every time the name of the evil Haman is mentioned, they roll them around, clack, 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 so that you can't hear the name of the evil spoken. Anybody who's heard anything about the biblical story, even just the story of Christ's birth, knows enough about Herod to realize that he's the proverbial bad guy in the story. It would almost be nice to have little noisemakers so that every time we speak the name of Herod, we can cover up his name so that we don't have to hear it. Somewhere along the line, over the course of the centuries, he has become known as not just King Herod, but Herod the Great. Now, there's some controversy about how that nickname got attached to his name. He's actually never referred to that way in the biblical story. And unlike other rulers of the day, he himself never described himself that way. I've often thought, though, that the nickname tells you a lot about a person. It's kind of like the handful of countries in the world who feel that they have to use the word democratic in their name. You know, as a rule of thumb, those countries that feel it necessary to use the title democratic in their title, they usually aren't. But as ironic as his nickname, Herod the Great, might be, I want to try something a little dangerous with you this morning. As we've worked our way through the Christmas story over these past few weeks, we've considered the fears of several of the characters, Zechariah's fears, and Mary's, and Joseph's, and the shepherds. We looked at the things they were afraid of, and I invited you to empathize with their fears, and then to understand how God was speaking to them through those fears. And this morning, as hard as that might be to imagine, I want you to think with me about Herod's fears, about what made Herod afraid. And I want to wrestle with you with the startling thought that we and King Herod might have a few things in common. Now, I realize this is a stretch. Normally, when we read a story, we don't like to identify with the bad guy. We like to identify with the good guys in the story. And I thought I'd help you in the process a little bit, and I'd dig a little bit to find out a little bit more about Herod. Maybe I can soften your view of King Herod. Maybe we've judged him a little too quickly. Maybe in Matthew 2, he's had one bad moment that overshadows a bunch of other good stuff that he did in his life. So as I dug a little bit, I discovered that Herod was not born into royal privilege. Nobody really expected him to wind up where he did. He was kind of a self-made man. Herod's father was a great politician, and he had two boys, and he positioned them very well, and he gradually pushed them into places of influence. He made sure they went to the right schools. He made sure they were studying with the right tutors and the right teachers. And apparently Herod himself knew how to work a room. He knew how to walk into a big gathering, talk to the right people, ask favors of the right people. He knew how to take great advantage of his connections and of the circumstances around him. And so in the uneasy compromise ground between the Romans and the Jewish authorities, he managed to wedge himself in and build a new royal dynasty from scratch that had never existed before. Now, the unusual thing is that he really wasn't entirely Jewish, and he really wasn't completely Roman. He was somewhere in the middle, and maybe because of that, he sort of managed to win support, and he created this role for himself and for his family that had never existed before, that nobody had ever expected, and nobody had even imagined this was possible. Now, you need to know that this was a territory that was virtually impossible to rule. And in this territory, Herod managed to rise to power, to make a name for himself, and to build a new royal lineage. For people like Pilate and other disgraced Roman authorities, this part of the empire was where you were sent as a punishment, to end your career in oblivion after you'd made an inept mistake somewhere else. You know, it was the equivalent of being shipped off to Siberia, or to, New Mexico, or to somewhere remote, or Alaska, where nobody knows you exist anymore. But Herod managed to flourish here. And the stuff he did was unbelievable. His public work projects were astounding. There were others in positions like his who just used the money to quietly line their pocket and let the common people suffer, allowing the public buildings to crumble into disrepair. Herod actually did exactly the opposite. Among many other impressive projects, Herod created a massive new port at Caesarea Maritima with a whole city around it, loading docks and commercial areas, with a huge city that created local wealth and thousands of jobs, and it put the area on the map. He created this whole area from scratch. He built up the big fortress at Masada. It was an impressive fortification. And of course, from the Jewish people's perspective, his great brainchild was the temple in Jerusalem and the surrounding Temple Mount Plateau that was known in its day as one of the most splendid buildings anywhere in the empire. But as often happens with great rulers who build themselves from scratch from humble beginnings, Herod spent his life with a chip on his shoulder, living with great fear and insecurity. Everything he did not only had to be good, it had to be the best. Everything he built didn't just need to be nice, it needed to overshadow every other building ever built. It had to be bigger than everything else. Every time he drew a crowd at an event, it had to be the largest crowd anybody had ever seen. Now, obviously, nobody like this would ever get to power today. It would never happen, you know. But this was Herod. I wonder what Herod's Twitter feed would have looked like if he'd had one. I don't know. After the big spurts of greatness early in his reign, after he'd established himself and forged his position, Herod became increasingly defensive, protective, and reclusive. There was this deep paranoia that set in, a paranoia that anybody would challenge his legitimacy or attempt to dethrone him. Every hint of accusation, every shadow of disloyalty was dealt with decisively. He didn't just fire people, he executed them. By the time the story of the Nativity unfolds in our text in Matthew 2, Herod has already had one of his sons killed because there were rumors that he was mounting a coup against his father. At one point, Herod was unhappy with the lackluster support he was getting from the woman who, by all accounts, had been the favorite of his many wives. This was a woman for whom he still clearly had some affection, judging by the way he mourned her, but Herod had her killed just to be safe. In the final years of his reign, Herod feels he needs to eliminate 2 more of his sons because he fears that they too are plotting against him. But he's worried about appearances because the last time he killed one of his sons, he just, happened in the middle of the night. He was summarily executed on a whim, and he thought he couldn't pull that off again. So this time he actually put together formal accusations. He got the crown prosecutor to do this. There was a trial and a whole legal process, and at the end of this legal process, his 2 boys were formally declared guilty. They were sentenced, and they were executed. One of the historians of the day commented that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be one of his sons. In just 3 or 4 years after the birth of Jesus, with his health waning, Herod is living reclusively in the palace at Jericho. The day of his funeral. This is our King Herod, Herod the Great. For historians and archaeologists, there are still questions about the historical timing and the details of the massacre of the innocent children mentioned in our text. The fact is that this event is not mentioned in other historical documents of the day. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It does suggest 2 things. First, it's likely that this was a small-scale event. Bethlehem was a small town. And perhaps there were no more than a couple dozen children that were killed. He killed just the boys under 2 years of age in a small village of several hundred people. There might have been 10, 20, 30 boys, probably not a large group. And secondly, this was a world in which rulers of Herod's caliber, with his approach to leadership, regularly made decisions like this that cost dozens of lives. And these decisions went unchallenged and unquestioned. The fact that this event would pass almost unnoticed and unmentioned in the annals of what Herod did during his reign certainly fits with what we expect in general, and more particularly with what we expect of Herod himself. Our text mentions 2 fears, and both of them are solidly grounded in what we know about Herod and his relationship with the people. When the Magi arrive at the palace in Jerusalem to inquire about the newborn king, Herod is troubled. He's afraid and he's disturbed. And the second fear, all of Jerusalem is troubled with him. Herod is afraid because he will accept no challenges to his authority. All of Jerusalem is worried with him because they know that nothing good can happen when this man is angry and troubled. When Herod gets upset, you dodge for cover. They've seen what he can do when things don't go his way. The last thing you want is to be around when Herod throws a hissy fit. So what does this cruel, paranoid Herod have to do with you and me? For a while there, maybe Herod the megalomaniac was starting to sound a little bit like somebody we might know in our day. Somebody who would do anything to stay in power. Somebody who would initiate any court challenge, ask for any recount, grasp at any straws to somehow hang in there at all costs to ensure his own legacy. Maybe we can relate Herod to somebody like that, but what does Herod have to do with you and me? Herod is actually at one end of a spectrum in our text. There are others who appear in the story for contrast. There are four kinds of people, I think, confronted with the life-changing arrival of Jesus Christ in the manger in our text. And the contrast between the four groups helps us to see the point about why Herod reacts the way he does. On the positive side of the spectrum, at this end of the line, we find Joseph. The silent, steady Joseph. I've told you this before. We don't have recounted a single word that Joseph ever speaks. Joseph never speaks in the Christmas story, never a word. And yet, as we saw last week, he accepts much of the responsibility and the hard work that will result from the birth of Jesus. The fact that this Christ child is born, that he's in danger, a lot of this falls on Joseph's shoulders. When the angel appears to explain that Jesus was conceived of the Holy Spirit and that he's come to save his people from their sins, with apparently little struggle or question, Joseph accepts that pronouncement and he allows his entire life to be turned upside down as he cares for this child. His priorities are completely shifted in a totally new direction because of the arrival of the Messiah. As a devout Jewish believer, this event, the arrival of the Messiah, is after all the fulfillment of all of Joseph's hopes and dreams and expectations. This is the event, the moment, the person he was waiting for. And the fact that it should come through his little family brings a mixture of fear and of joy, but Joseph responds positively. And in every sense of the word, he submits his life, all of his life, to the arrival of the Messiah, and to serving and protecting and safeguarding this little child. And as Matthew tells the story of Jesus to his Jewish audience, Joseph represents the desired outcome. The way Joseph reacts and responds is the way that Matthew wants you to respond to the news that the Messiah has arrived. But there's further impetus. Matthew includes the stories of others who also responded positively. And in one sense, I think maybe they deserve even a little more credit than Joseph. Joseph was up close and personal. He read the Old Testament. He was waiting for the Messiah. He worshiped at the temple. He was there. He was nearby. He was involved. But the Magi, they lived in a different country, far away, in an entirely different culture. They spoke a different language. The words used to describe them is the same word that's used of the wise men, astrologers, who rubbed shoulders with Daniel when he was in Babylon. It appears likely that during their many decades in Babylon, Daniel and his friends had an impact on the learned people around them. It's likely that they would have brought copies of the Jewish holy writings with them. This is what the Babylonians did. They prided themselves on their open-mindedness. And they aggressively collected in their libraries the writings and the wisdom of all of the other cultures and languages that they subdued. So when Daniel goes to Babylon with his friends, there in Babylon, there are wise men and shining, intelligent young men from all of these different cultures, and they all bring all of their holy writings with them. And in this university in Babylon, in this library, there's all this collection of holy writings and wise people, and they all share what they believe. And these wise men would have heard what Daniel shared. But instead of Daniel and his friends being completely Babylonized by what was around them, Instead of being changed by everything else they heard in this mishmash, it was they who had an impact on everyone else. And the Babylonians heard what Daniel had to say, and it struck a chord. When Daniel was there, he would express to the Babylonian wise men the longing and desire of the Jewish people for a Messiah, for a Redeemer, for a Prince of Peace. This expectation, this waiting, this longing was central to their faith. And we believe that when the Magi in Babylon saw whatever it is that they saw in the stars and the constellation, they put two and two together. And God used those apparitions to confirm to them that the long-expected new Jewish king was born. They made the link, we think, with what Daniel had told them. And to their credit, to the wise men's credit, in response to what many of us would feel to be very limited evidence and direction, they traveled a great distance to a foreign land. They pay respects to a newborn king amidst the people whom their nation had conquered and humiliated many centuries before. How much of a stretch was that? Imagine the humility and the openness required of the Magi to do this, to make so great and so positive a response and reaction to such a gentle, small leading from God. This is absolutely striking, shows an unbelievable amount of faith. When I think of the Magi, I often think of Jesus' comment to Thomas. Thomas, who would only believe after seeing the wounds in the risen Jesus and placing his fingers and the nail prints in his hands. You remember Jesus tells Thomas that in contrast, there will be much greater blessing for all those who believe without actually seeing what he was privileged to see. The Magi did that with very little to go on. They come to see the Christ child. And the Magi are partially a response to those who question the injustice of expecting people in faraway countries and other cultures to respond to a Jesus they have never met or even heard of. How can you do this? How can you say Jesus is the only way? There's people far away in other countries, other cultures, other language who haven't met Jesus. How can you expect them to respond to Jesus? There's a promise in the Scriptures that all those who seek God with all their heart will find him. It's not just that God takes pleasure in allowing himself to be found. It is that for everyone who will listen and think and perceive with an open heart, God plants the seeds and the signs that they can follow to find the Redeemer that God has sent. And with humility and honesty, the Magi follow the trail of breadcrumbs, little bits and pieces that they had, but they follow them. And it leads these wealthy and distinguished officials of a distant realm not to a coronation ceremony in the palace of the capital city, but to a modest little house in a village so small that even its neighbors mock it. And there they will kneel before the infant king of another nation, of another culture, apparently accepting his lordship and his sovereignty. I'm impressed by the Magi. I don't know whether they're a little further along the line than Joseph. But I wonder, after going through all this trouble, I wonder what the Magi thought when they arrive in Israel. After going through all of that effort, they arrive in Israel and they see all this nonchalance. There's this newborn child, there's this Messiah, and nobody else is excited about it. Nobody else is around. The neighbors, it's like nothing has happened. It seems from the text that they had understood that this newborn child was so important. They expected to arrive in the middle of the planning for some large public coronation ceremony. So they arrive at Jerusalem, at the palace, but they're greeted with this collective shrug. Oh, yeah, maybe Bethlehem, I don't know. Yeah. And nobody there seems to have any idea of the importance of the events that have just unfolded right under their noses, right in their backyard, while they continue going about their ordinary lives completely undisturbed. And on that front, none are more shocking and none make me angrier than the chief priests and the scribes that Herod consults. If Joseph and the wise men are over here, the scribes and the chief priests are definitely on this end of the spectrum. After the arrival of the wise men, Herod calls them together and he asks them this unbelievable question: where is the Messiah to be born? Now, I'm not sure what I'm more shocked by. that they tell them almost instantly. It sounds like they don't even need to use the concordance. They know exactly where to go. They turn to Micah. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. They know the Messianic test down pat. And given that the expectation of the Messiah was the single most important thing at the heart of their faith, that it was the one thing that had defined them and their way of life, you would think that they want to know why. Stories, but you can't really take this stuff seriously. I mean, really, a descendant of David this many centuries after, there hasn't been a king in years. And a child born of a virgin? What's the matter? Don't you have a science textbook? What's wrong with you? Born to reign on the throne forever, coming to redeem his people? I mean, come on, nice stories, but who really believes this stuff anymore? All indications are that the scribes and the chief priests never even left the city, never even trekked the few miles to Bethlehem to see what had happened, never even came back to Herod with another question. I fear for the things the chief priests and the scribes will have to answer to for one day when Jesus Christ returns to judge the world as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When they were told, these men, that the Creator had come incarnate in the flesh of Jesus, in the person of Jesus Christ, and that they had failed to pay him respect, to worship him as they should have, like many others, they say, well, we didn't know. We never met Jesus. How are we supposed to know? And then they will be reminded of this day in the palace when the Magi came from far away, and Herod asked them this intriguing question, and they weren't even curious. They never even considered the possibility. They couldn't be bothered to check it out. One of the reasons why we need to be as present as possible in this community scares me a little bit. One of the reasons that we need to be as clear as we possibly can in proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ is that men and women around us need to be confronted with the most important truth that can ever be considered. A truth and a response that has life-changing and eternal consequences. And on the negative side, it means that there are men and women around us in this community who will one day stand before Jesus Christ the judge, and they will say, but I never knew, I never met Jesus. How can I be held responsible for not responding to him? And they will be told that in their neighborhood, a few minutes walk from their house where they lived, clearly and regularly, every week for 156 years, Jesus Christ was proclaimed. The doors were opened. The services were live streamed. The Bible was opened. The message was clear. They are without excuse. Jesus Christ was there, within reach, and they chose to look the other way. But on the positive side, we want to be a clear beacon of light for the gospel. Because if there is just a chance that there's anybody out there who is searching, if there's another magi, if there's a wise man out there who wants to know, who's intrigued about Jesus, in whose heart the Holy Spirit is stirring, we want them to know where to come and find him. And so let us be clear as 2021 begins that as your minister and as a congregation, there are many good things that we do together in this community. But none of them are more important than this one central thing we do, of proclaiming Jesus Christ as the Messiah and the Redeemer, as the way, the truth, and the life, aside from whom no one comes to the Father. Let us never shy away from that clear proclamation, nor ever let it get lost in the hustle and bustle of other things we do. So Joseph and the Magi are over here at this end of the spectrum. and violent reign of terror. But there is a sense in which he is just like many of us. Strangely, Herod always thought himself a devout Jew. He went to great lengths to prove his legitimacy as a Jewish king. Herod was actually born in Idumea, just south of Judea. His father was an Edomite, and his Edomite ancestors at some point had converted to Judaism. Technically, culturally, they were Nabateans. They're Arabs. But they intermingled and married and commingled with the Judeans, and they, over time, adopted much of their customs. But it was more of a way of life than a faith. And one of Herod's wives had been an Edomite. And Herod clung fervently, at least to the appearance that he was Jewish. You know, he liked to have pictures of himself taken holding a Bible in front. Oh, no, sorry, that's not Herod, sorry. He paid great amounts of money to have fancy sacrifices offered. He went to great trouble to have the temple rebuilt, expanded, and beautified. I've told you this before. He wanted to be so sure that his temple was the greatest and biggest Jewish temple that when he built it, he took the dimensions of the tabernacle, the dimension of Solomon's temple, the dimensions of the second temple. He added all those together. He multiplied by 2, and he added 1 cubit just to be sure that his Jewish temple was more Jewish than all the other temples that had ever been built. But the problem was his lifestyle. His lifestyle was bad enough that it excluded him from participating in the worship in the temple. He wasn't just divorced, he was married to several women at the same time. And the parties that occurred in his royal residences, well, they were legendary. And all of this disqualified him as an active participant in Jewish religious life. But he still wanted to be the king of the Jews. And the responses to him were varied. The scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests and the Levites, they thought, well, Herod's not the best guy around, but, we've got a new temple and we're safe and, he gives us financial support and he contributes to, and they just kind of looked the other way. Now, there are others who couldn't stand him, the Essenes. They withdrew to the Qumran community in the desert hills. And it's a good thing they did. It's because of them that we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they wanted nothing to do with the temple and the whole city of Jerusalem. That whole thing was corrupt because it was connected to Herod. This philandering party animal had no restraint in his personal life and certainly no legitimate claim to the throne of Israel. And you see, Herod's thing is that he wanted to be religious when it was convenient for him. He liked the glitz and the glamour and the singing and the psalms and the sacrifices and the beautiful temple. And he liked to make these sudden elaborate shows of generosity at Christmas and Easter and New Year. And he liked to pay to have these outlandish sacrifices offered. And it was even suggested he liked the idea of laying claim to the legitimacy of the throne of David. After all, under the nose of the Romans, he had built this royal Jewish dynasty from scratch. He wanted the trappings of religion when it was convenient for him, but he wasn't about it to let it ruin his lifestyle. He especially wasn't about to let anybody else call the shots. He was the boss of him, and nobody was going to be allowed to challenge that. In a preemptive echo of so many in our day, I think Herod might have told you that he was spiritual, but not religious, He liked the trappings and the celebrations. He liked the beautiful, awe-inspiring buildings. He liked to make generous contributions once in a while to show that he was really a good person deep down. But he wasn't about to let somebody else tell him what to do or how to run his life. He was in control, and he would never give that up. I wonder whether this might just be the most insulting thing anybody has ever told you. And it's going to come from your minister on the first Sunday morning of the new year, in the afterglow of our Christmas celebrations, still surrounded by our Christmas decorations. I want to tell you that some of you remind me a little bit of Herod. Now, don't get upset yet. Hear me out. I'm not suggesting that you can round up the neighborhood kids and slaughter them, or that you had one of your wives beheaded. That's not what I mean. But for many of you, like Herod, you like the idea of spiritual things. You like coming to worship once in a while to make it look good. You like to be around the church building and the hymns and the singing and the trappings. You like that. It's comfortable. And you certainly think of yourself as a Christian. You would argue with anybody who suggested that you're not. You're part of the group. And you would defend that with all that you've got. But you're not about to let any of that make any significant changes to your life. Because you're the boss. You're the boss of you, and you're calling the shots. And nobody's going to tell you what to do and what not to do. So you like the innocent child in the manger. He's cute and cuddly. But when that baby thinks he can start calling himself king and Lord and telling you what to do, then you draw the line. You share Herod's fear. You're not about to relinquish control of your precious private life to anybody else. I've often thought about how appropriate it is that it's near the start of each year that we celebrate Epiphany. That moment when the wise men came from a great distance to worship and bow homage to the Christ child. It's appropriate because at the start of the new year we rethink and we reset our priorities for the new year. And there's a question in celebration of Epiphany that you and I both need to answer. Over these last few weeks, we've crowded together around the manger. We've sung the hymns and eaten the fruitcake and done everything else. And we've kind of struggled to sort of get a look at the newborn king, just to get a glimpse of his beauty and the glow in the manger. Together, we've rejoiced at his coming. We've been excited by the possibilities and the great positive ways in which our world might be made a better place if we all just listened to Jesus a little more and were inspired by his positive image and loved people a little better. But there's a bottom line question about you and the child of the manger. Now, I've come to realize that Protestant Christians in North America don't do this as much because they're afraid of the idolatry issue. But when I was growing up, one of the Christmas traditions we inherited from my dad's European side of the family was our little manger scene. We had a little nativity set at home, and there were a bunch of characters to it, and I think some of them were carved in wood, the one we had for a lot of years. Some of you might have one at home. And there was a little stable with a star, and there's the manger with little baby Jesus and Joseph and Mary, and then there's all the other characters. There's a couple of shepherds with a few of their sheep, and then there's the Magi with their gifts. I remember one of the manger sets we had for a little while. It included a few tiny sheep and the small gifts from the Magi and the stars and the other bits and pieces. And every year when we'd wrap it up in the packing material to keep it safely for the following year, sometimes we'd lose these bits and pieces in the packing material. And when you unpacked it, you always had to, I think about the second year we lost the little bottle of myrrh and we never found it again after that. But from one year to the next, there it was. And there was a little table, a little stand that we'd place at the foot of the tree, and we'd set up the manger scene. It was Jesus and the manger and Joseph and Mary. You know, we put them right in the stable, protected from the rain and the snow, and we'd pack it with a little straw around there so the animals would be comfortable. And then you have to arrange the other characters. And I was always struck that the other characters around the manger scene, they came in two different positions. And they couldn't move because they were carved out of wood, you know. Some of them are standing. I remember there was a shepherd leaning on a staff. And there was one of the wise men who always stood further back because he was holding the camel, and the camel kind of couldn't make it into the main, so he was always standing sort of at the back holding the reins of the camel. But there were a few of the little sculpted characters that were carved in kneeling positions. They were kneeling. And they're the ones that you always had to put a little closer to the manger. Kneeling by the Christ child, on their knees, in front of a baby. Not just in worship, but in an act of submission. I've been glad to see how many of you have joined us over the last few weeks to celebrate Christmas, particularly online. It's been really nice to have you join us. The choir did a great job, particularly with the Christmas Eve service. It was comfortable and it was filled with pleasant thoughts. And I mean, you know, it's a cute, cuddly baby. What's there not to like? Who would object to that? But you see, coming to the manger has consequences. What we find there raises expectations of us. As we've crowded around the manger together, I'm really glad that you've joined us, but I wonder whether you're one of the people who's standing near the back at a safe distance, lost in the crowd, sort of happy that Jesus is there, but still standing. Or whether you're one of those who's come close one of those who's come really close, one of those who are on your knees before the Christ child. Because, my friends, make no mistake about it, you haven't really celebrated Christmas until you've knelt before the manger. I wonder whether you've done that. Amen. Let's pray together. Mighty God, Lord of heaven and earth, we've been drawn again in this Christmas season in the past weeks to the warmth and light of the manger. We thought we were coming to gaze at a sweet child lovingly cuddled and swaddled in his mother's arms. And instead we found the one who is the fulfillment of all of our best hopes and our greatest aspirations. And that says so much at this time of uncertainty. We've come to find redemption. We've come to find a better world. But if those changes must happen, they must begin with us. We must let go. We must relinquish control and let the reign of the Christ child begin in us, begin in our hearts, changing who we are and what we do. Release us from Herod's fear. Release us from our desire for control, for power, for self-determination. Help us bow the knee, bow our hearts, and bow our lives to the child of the manger, the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, and let the increase of his reign begin here in us today. Amen.